The bright morning sun streamed through the airport windows as a well-dressed woman in her mid-40s walked confidently through the terminal, pulling her carry-on suitcase behind her. As one of the city's top corporate attorneys, she had spent the last 15 years building her reputation in the courtroom, defending clients with the same determination that had gotten her through Harvard Law School while working two jobs. Today was supposed to be a simple journey home to Chicago after winning a major case. Her designer briefcase held the paperwork from her victory, a discrimination lawsuit she'd won for a small business owner. The irony of what was about to unfold wasn't lost on her, looking back on this moment later. She treated herself to a first-class ticket, something she did occasionally when the work weeks were especially demanding. This past week definitely qualified, with late nights poring over legal documents and preparing witness statements. All she wanted now was to sink into a comfortable seat and maybe enjoy a glass of wine before catching up on some sleep. The boarding area was buzzing with the usual morning crowd. Business travelers typing away on laptops, families corralling excited children, and flight crews walking briskly past with their perfectly arranged uniforms and rolling bags. She double-checked her boarding pass on her phone, even though she'd already memorized all the details. Flight 2471, Seat 3A, First Class. She'd earned this small luxury with years of hard work and determination. Her thoughts drifted to her grandmother, who had cleaned houses for wealthy families to put her children through school. "Education is the one thing they can't take from you," she would always say. Now, standing in her tailored suit with her platinum frequent flyer card, she was living proof of her grandmother's wisdom. But sometimes, as she was about to be reminded, success didn't shield you from certain realities. When the gate agent called for first-class boarding, she gathered her belongings and joined the line. A few passengers ahead of her chatted about golf courses and board meetings, while behind her, a couple discussed their upcoming vacation. It was just another morning at the airport, or at least it seemed that way. She smiled politely at the gate agent, who barely glanced at her boarding pass before waving her through. The jet bridge stretched out before her as she walked toward the aircraft, her heels clicking against the floor in a steady rhythm. She was already thinking about the presentations she needed to prepare for next week's client meetings. The smell of fresh coffee greeted her as she stepped onto the plane. A flight attendant stood at the entrance, offering the practiced smile that came with years of customer service. "Welcome aboard," the attendant said, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Something in that look made our attorney pause for just a moment, but she brushed it off. After all, this was just another flight. As she approached row 3, she noticed how the morning light played across the leather seats. These quiet moments before takeoff were usually her favorite part of flying. The anticipation of leaving the ground, the promise of peaceful hours above the clouds. She couldn't have known that in just a few minutes, this routine flight would turn into something that would make headlines across the country and spark a conversation about privilege, prejudice, and the power of keeping your cool when the world seems determined to make you lose it. Little did she know that her years of handling tense courtroom situations were about to come in handy in a way she never expected. As she stored her suitcase in the overhead compartment, she was completely unaware that this flight would not only test her patience, but would also give her an opportunity to create lasting change in an industry that desperately needed it. Just as she was settling into her comfortable first-class seat and pulling out her laptop to review some case files, a shadow fell across her tray table. Looking up, she met the cold stare of a flight attendant who had suddenly appeared beside her seat. The attendant's perfectly pressed uniform and rigid posture couldn't mask the look of disapproval that flickered across her face. "Excuse me," the flight attendant said, her voice carrying just loud enough for nearby passengers to hear, "but I believe you may be in the wrong cabin." She didn't even attempt to hide the condescension in her tone. "This section is for first-class passengers only." Each word was carefully emphasized, as if speaking to someone who might not understand English well. The attorney took a deep breath, remaining professional despite the clear implications. "Yes, I'm aware," she replied calmly, reaching for her phone to pull up her boarding pass. "I have a first-class ticket. Here it is." She held up the screen, displaying her ticket information clearly. The flight attendant barely glanced at the phone. "There must be some mistake," she insisted, her voice growing louder. "Let me see your paper boarding pass." When the attorney explained she had checked in electronically, the attendant's lips pressed into a thin line. "Well, we've had issues with the electronic system before. I'll need to verify this with the gate." By now, other passengers were watching the scene unfold. Some pretended to be absorbed in their phones or magazines, while others openly stared. A businessman across the aisle shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his own first-class ticket suddenly feeling like a weight in his pocket. A couple in the row behind whispered to each other, their words just quiet enough to be indistinct, but their disapproving tone clear as day. The attorney maintained her composure, though her heart was racing. She'd faced tough judges and aggressive opposing counsel, but there was something particularly humiliating about being questioned in front of a plane full of strangers. "I'd be happy to show you my ID as well," she offered, her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "That won't be necessary," the flight attendant replied dismissively. "I'll need to check with my supervisor. In the meantime, we have seats available in economy if you'd like to move back there." She gestured toward the back of the plane as if she was doing the attorney a favor. A young flight attendant in training stood nearby, watching the situation with visible discomfort. She kept glancing between her senior colleague and the attorney, clearly torn between professional loyalty and her own sense of right and wrong. Her hands fidgeted with the safety demonstration equipment she was holding. The attorney noticed several phones being raised discreetly around the cabin. In 2024, every public interaction had the potential to become viral content, and this scene was definitely drawing attention. She thought about all the similar incidents she'd seen on social media, never imagining she'd find herself in the middle of one. "I appreciate your concern," the attorney said firmly, drawing on years of courtroom experience to keep her voice level. "But I won't be moving. I paid for this seat. I have my confirmation right here, and I have every right to be here. If you'd like to escalate this to your supervisor, I'm happy to wait, but I'll be waiting right here in my assigned seat." The flight attendant's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger was hard to tell. She turned sharply on her heel, muttering something about following protocol, as she marched toward the front of the plane. The air in first class grew thick with tension as passengers exchanged glances, some sympathetic, others curious about what would happen next. What none of them knew was that this confrontation was about to transform from a moment of discrimination into something much more significant, a catalyst for change that would reach far beyond this single flight and this one incident. The minutes that followed felt like hours as other passengers boarded the plane, each passing by with curious glances at the unfolding drama in first class. The attorney sat straight in her seat, appearing calm on the outside, while her mind raced through every similar case she'd handled over her 15-year career. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just yesterday, she'd been arguing a discrimination case in court, and now here she was, living through one. The flight attendant returned, this time with two other crew members in tow. One wore the stripes of a senior crew member, while the other clutched a tablet, presumably containing passenger manifests. "Ma'am," the first flight attendant announced loudly, "there seems to be a problem with your reservation." Her voice carried deliberately through the cabin, drawing even more attention to the situation. A young mother in economy class, visible through the curtain divider, was explaining quietly to her curious child why everyone was looking toward the front of the plane. Several more phones were raised, their cameras capturing every moment of what was quickly becoming a viral incident in the making. "I've checked the system," the flight attendant continued, her voice dripping with artificial concern, "and it shows some irregularities with your ticket purchase. For everyone's comfort and safety, we'll need you to move to economy class while we sort this out." She emphasized the word safety, as if the attorney's presence in first class somehow threatened it. The attorney took another steady breath before speaking. Her voice, trained by years of courtroom experience, carried clearly but calmly through the cabin. "I understand you're doing your job," she began, "but I need to be clear about something. I purchased this ticket legitimately. I am a platinum member of your airline's frequent flyer program. I've flown this route dozens of times. The only irregularity here seems to be your assumption about where I belong on this aircraft." The businessman across the aisle, who had been fidgeting uncomfortably with his collar, suddenly spoke up. "She's right. You know, I've seen her on this route before." His unexpected support caused the flight attendant's composed facade to crack slightly. The senior crew member, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. Unlike his colleague, he actually took the time to look at the attorney's phone, examining her ticket details carefully. His expression shifted from professional neutrality to growing concern as he realized the situation unfolding before him. 2 rows back, an elderly woman whispered loudly to her seatmate, "This is absolutely shameful. In this day and age." Her words, though meant for her companion, carried through the now silent cabin. More passengers were turning in their seats, many recording the scene on their phones, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The attorney pulled out her business card, embossed with her law firm's prestigious address, and handed it to the senior crew member. "I would be happy to have your corporate office contact my firm about this incident," she said quietly, but with unmistakable authority. "I'm sure they'd be very interested in reviewing how your staff handles passenger verification procedures." The senior crew member's eyes widened slightly as he read the card, finally understanding the full gravity of the situation. The first flight attendant's face had lost its smug expression, replaced by something closer to panic as she realized her actions might have serious consequences. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," the senior crew member said quickly, shooting a sharp look at his colleague. "Of course you're welcome to remain in your assigned seat. We apologize for any inconvenience." But everyone knew this weak apology couldn't erase what had just happened. As the crew members retreated, whispered conversations broke out across the cabin. The attorney could hear fragments of discussions about social media and going viral, knowing that this incident would likely extend far beyond this flight. She pulled out her phone and began taking notes, documenting every detail while it was fresh in her mind. This wasn't just about one uncomfortable moment on a plane anymore. It was about making sure it didn't happen to anyone else. The attorney knew this moment required more than just angry words or threats of lawsuits. Drawing on years of handling tense situations in court, she pressed a call button. The young flight attendant in training responded, nervously approaching her seat. "Could you please get the flight supervisor?" she asked politely. Not the senior crew member, the actual supervisor for this flight. While waiting, she noticed how the other passengers had formed a sort of silent support system. The businessman who had spoken up earlier gave her a respectful nod. A young professional woman, a few rows back, mouthed, "We've got it all on video." Even the flight attendant trainee managed a small, encouraging smile before hurrying away. The flight supervisor arrived quickly, her shoulders squared and face professionally neutral. She was older than the other crew members, with streaks of gray in her hair and the kind of confidence that came from decades of handling difficult situations. "I understand there's been some confusion about seating," she began, her tone carefully measured. "No confusion," the attorney replied calmly, maintaining eye contact. "Just discrimination. And I'd like to walk you through exactly what happened." She pulled out her phone where she'd been documenting everything in precise detail. "Would you like to know how many corporate discrimination cases I've won over the past 15 years? Or should we focus on how your airline plans to address this incident?" The supervisor listened intently as the attorney recounted the events, her expression growing more concerned with each detail. Other passengers chimed in, providing their observations. The elderly woman from 2 rows back insisted on giving her contact information as a witness. "I've been flying this airline for 40 years, she declared loudly, "and I've never seen anything so disgraceful." Instead of making threats or demands, The attorney presented a solution. "Your airline has an opportunity here," she explained, her voice steady and clear. "We can turn this into a teaching moment. I'm willing to work with your corporate team on improving staff training. My firm has experience in developing anti-bias programs that actually work." The supervisor, recognizing both the threat and the opportunity in this situation, nodded slowly. "I'd like to start by removing the flight attendant in question from service for the remainder of this flight," she offered. "And I'll need your contact information for our corporate office. They'll want to speak with you directly." As this conversation unfolded, the original flight attendant stood at the front of the cabin, her face pale as she realized the magnitude of her actions. The other passengers weren't even pretending not to watch anymore. Several had their phones out, still recording, while others typed furiously on their devices, no doubt sharing the story on social media. A teenager in the last row of first class raised his hand hesitantly. "Ma'am," he called out to the attorney, "I just wanted you to know your story is already trending. My friends are sharing it like crazy." His mother, sitting next to him, showed her phone screen. The video of the earlier confrontation was indeed spreading rapidly across multiple platforms. The attorney took a moment to process this information. She hadn't planned on becoming a viral sensation today, but if that's what it took to create real change, she was prepared. She turned back to the supervisor, her voice firm but constructive. "I think we need to discuss how your airline plans to handle the media attention this is about to receive. And more importantly, how we can use this situation to prevent similar incidents in the future." The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted dramatically. What started as an attempt to humiliate had transformed into a powerful moment of solidarity and potential change. The attorney could feel it. This wasn't just about one flight anymore. It was about setting a precedent, about showing that standing up for yourself didn't mean losing your dignity or professionalism. As the flight prepared for takeoff, news of the incident was spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. The flight supervisor had taken the discriminatory flight attendant off duty, replacing her with the young trainee who had shown kindness earlier. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed from tense to something closer to a community united in support of justice. The supervisor returned to the attorney's seat just before the main cabin door closed. "Our corporate office has already been notified," she said quietly. "They've asked to set up a meeting with you as soon as we land in Chicago." She paused, then added more personally, "I've been flying for 25 years, and I want you to know this isn't what we stand for." The attorney nodded, appreciating the sincerity in the supervisor's voice. She could see the woman was genuinely troubled by what had happened. "Change happens when good people acknowledge there's a problem," she replied. "I'm more interested in fixing things than pointing fingers." A gentle ding signaled the start of pre-flight announcements. The young trainee, now handling the first-class cabin, delivered the safety demonstration with extra attention and warmth. Her hands shook slightly as she demonstrated the oxygen mask, but her smile was genuine when she caught the attorney's eye. The businessman across the aisle leaned over during taxi. "I'm on the board of directors for several companies," he mentioned quietly. "Would you be interested in consulting with them about diversity training? What happened here today? It's not unique to airlines." He passed her his business card discreetly. As the plane took off, the attorney's phone buzzed with notifications despite being in airplane mode. Her law firm was trying to reach her. The incident had already made its way to their attention. The video was spreading across social media platforms, with hashtags demanding accountability and change. The elderly woman from 2 rows back got up once the seatbelt sign was off, ignoring the usual protocol of staying seated. "I just got a message from my granddaughter," she whispered excitedly. "She's a journalist with a major news network. They want to cover your story. This could really make a difference." The attorney took a moment to look out the window at the clouds below. She thought about her grandmother again, about all the quiet indignities she had endured without the power of social media or viral videos to amplify her voice. Times had changed, but some battles remained the same. They just had new tools for fighting them. The young trainee came by with drink service, her hands steadier now. "I just wanted you to know," she whispered while pouring coffee, "what you did today. It's why I wanted to become a flight attendant. To make everyone feel welcome in the skies." Her eyes were bright with emotion. Throughout the flight, various passengers found excuses to walk past her seat, offering quiet words of support or simply nodding in solidarity. A group of college students in economy had apparently started an online petition demanding airline-wide bias training. Their enthusiasm for justice was contagious. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their initial descent into Chicago. The attorney noticed that even his usual scripted announcement seemed warmer, more personal somehow. Word had clearly reached the entire crew about what had transpired. As she packed up her laptop and prepared for landing, the attorney reflected on how a simple flight home had turned into something much bigger. The incident had revealed both the worst and the best of human nature, the initial prejudice, but also the overwhelming support from strangers who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. The view of Chicago's skyline appeared through her window, and she knew that when this plane landed, it wouldn't be the end of the story. It would be the beginning of real change, not just for one airline, but for an entire industry that needed to take a hard look at its biases and practices. By the time the plane touched down in Chicago, the incident had exploded across social media. As passengers turned their phones back on, the cabin filled with gasps and murmured conversations. The video had been shared millions of times, picked up by major news networks, and was trending nationwide. The attorney's phone nearly buzzed off her armrest with incoming notifications. "You're trending at number 1, the teenager from the last row called out excitedly. "People are calling you the first-class fighter." His mother quickly shushed him, but not before several other passengers pulled out their phones to check for themselves. The hashtag #firstclassfighter was indeed dominating social media, alongside hashtag #flyingwhileblack and hashtag #enough is enough. As the plane taxied to the gate, the flight supervisor approached one last time. There's a bit of a situation at the terminal," she said hesitantly. "Several news crews got wind of what happened. They're waiting at the gate." She paused, then added, "Security can escort you through a private exit if you prefer." The attorney straightened her jacket and smiled. "No need for that," she replied. "This isn't something that should be hidden away. Real change happens in the open." Several passengers nodded in agreement, some even applauding softly. The young trainee, who had shown kindness throughout the flight, rushed up with tears in her eyes. "My mom just sent me a screenshot," she said, holding out her phone. "Your story is being shared by celebrities. They're all talking about making airlines accountable." Her voice trembled with emotion and excitement. As passengers began standing to retrieve their bags, something unexpected happened. The businessman who had spoken up earlier stood and addressed the cabin. "Folks, I think we all witnessed something important today. Let's make sure this story gets told right." He turned to the attorney. "Would you mind if we all walked out together? Show them what solidarity looks like." One by one, other passengers voiced their agreement. The elderly woman insisted on walking right beside the attorney. The college students from economy class asked if they could film the moment for their social justice social media accounts. Even the pilot emerged from the cockpit, offering a firm handshake and his card, promising to testify about the incident if needed. The attorney felt overwhelmed by the support, but in a good way. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It had become something bigger. As they approached the gate, she could see the flash of cameras through the windows. News crews were positioned just beyond the gate area, and a crowd had gathered. "Remember," she said to those walking with her, "this isn't about anger or revenge. It's about making things right. About making sure nobody else has to go through this." The passengers around her nodded in understanding. This was about dignity, respect, and necessary change. As the plane door opened, the young trainee quickly straightened the attorney's collar and whispered, "You showed me what real professionalism looks like today. Thank you. The gesture was small but meaningful, a reminder that change often starts with individual acts of kindness and courage. The attorney took a deep breath and stepped into the jet bridge, surrounded by her impromptu support team. Behind her, she could hear passengers already telling reporters their versions of what had happened. Each one emphasized not just the discrimination they'd witnessed, but the way she had handled it with grace and determination. The story was no longer just about one incident on one flight. It had become a catalyst for a larger conversation about bias, privilege, and the power of standing up for what's right. As she emerged into the terminal, cameras flashing and reporters calling out questions, she knew that her grandmother's words about education being power had taken on a new meaning. Today, she would educate not just a flight crew or an airline, but an entire nation watching and listening. In the days following the flight incident, the attorney found herself at the center of a movement she never expected to lead. Instead of pursuing a lawsuit, she chose a different path that surprised many. Sitting in her office, surrounded by messages of support from around the world, she drafted a proposal that would change airline industry standards forever. The airline's CEO had personally called her the morning after the incident. "We don't want to just smooth this over," he had said, his voice carrying genuine concern. "We want to fix the underlying problems. Would you be willing to help us?" The attorney heard sincerity in his voice that went beyond damage control. She looked at the sticky note on her desk where she'd written down the numbers. The video had been viewed over 50 million times, shared by celebrities, politicians, and civil rights leaders. But what caught her attention most were the thousands of comments from ordinary people sharing their own similar experiences. "I could sue," she told the CEO during their meeting in his office. "But that would just be a band-aid on a much bigger wound. Instead, I have a different proposal." She pulled out a detailed plan for a comprehensive training program she developed over 3 sleepless nights. The young flight attendant trainee from the flight had reached out through social media. "I'd want to be part of the change," she'd written. "Many of us do." Her message was one of hundreds from airline staff across the country, all expressing their desire to do better, to be better. In a surprisingly bold move, the airline agreed to let news cameras film their first training session. The attorney stood before a room of flight attendants, pilots, and ground crew, with the discriminatory flight attendant from her flight sitting in the front row. Instead of shame, the focus was on growth and understanding. "We're not here to point fingers," she began, addressing the room and the cameras. "We're here to open eyes, minds, and hearts." The training session became a powerful dialogue about unconscious bias, privilege, and the small moments that could make or break a passenger's dignity. The flight attendant who had discriminated against her approached during a break, tears streaming down her face. "I never saw myself as prejudiced," she admitted. "But watching that video of myself, I didn't recognize the person I was being." Her honesty became a powerful teaching moment in itself. The businessman from the flight kept his word. Soon, other major corporations were calling, asking for similar training programs. The attorney found herself building a new division in her law firm focused entirely on corporate diversity education. "Prevention is better than litigation," became her new motto. 3 months after the incident, surveys showed a significant decrease in discriminatory complaints across the airline industry. Other airlines had adopted similar training programs, not wanting to risk becoming the next viral story. The attorney's inbox filled with messages from grateful travelers who noticed the difference. The elderly passenger who had supported her on the flight invited her to speak at a community center. "Your story gave people hope," she said. "Not because you got angry, but because you chose to make things better." The room was packed with people of all ages, eager to learn how one person's dignity could spark industry-wide change. Back in her office, looking at a photo of her grandmother, the attorney reflected on how a moment of discrimination had transformed into a movement of education and change. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from the young trainee, now promoted to lead flight attendant, sharing how the new training program had changed their entire crew's perspective. The most powerful moment came when she received a letter from a young girl who had seen her story. "When I grow up," the letter read, "I want to be strong and kind like you. You showed me that we can fight unfairness without losing ourselves." That letter now hung framed on her office wall, a reminder that change often comes not from anger, but from wisdom and determination. 2 years had passed since that fateful flight, and the changes it sparked were bigger than anyone could have imagined. The attorney stood at the podium of a major airline industry conference, looking out at faces from every major carrier in the country. The room was packed with executives, flight crews, and training staff, all eager to hear from the woman who had transformed their industry. Behind her on the giant screen, statistics told an impressive story. Customer satisfaction scores had soared across all airlines. Complaints about discrimination had dropped by 70%. But more importantly, the culture of air travel had shifted. The photos scrolling behind her showed diverse crews, happy passengers, and a new era of inclusive air travel. The young trainee, now a senior flight attendant and training coordinator, sat in the front row. She had become one of the most passionate advocates for the new training program, traveling across the country to help implement it at different airlines. Her own story of growth and change had inspired countless others in the industry. "Success isn't just about numbers," the attorney told the audience. "It's about the stories I hear every day. The elderly passenger who felt respected, the family who wasn't separated because of assumptions, the crew members who found their voices to stand up for what's right." Her words resonated through the silent hall. During the break, several airline CEOs approached her with their own stories of transformation. One shared how his daughter had seen the viral video in school, where it was now part of a curriculum about civil rights and social change. Another mentioned how their hiring practices had evolved, leading to the most diverse workforce in their company's history. The original flight attendant who had discriminated against her was there too, but in a different role now. After going through the training program, she had become an advocate for change herself, sharing her story as a powerful example of how bias could be recognized and overcome. "I was the villain in the story," she often said, "but I chose to become part of the solution." A group of flight attendants from different airlines had started a support network, sharing experiences and strategies for creating inclusive environments at 30,000 feet. They called themselves the Sky Unity Network, and their lapel pins had become a recognized symbol of commitment to equality in the air. During the conference lunch break, the attorney's phone buzzed with a message. It was from a pilot who had seen her original story. He shared a photo of his young daughter in her pilot's Halloween costume, along with a note. "Because of you, she believes the sky's the limit for everyone." These were the moments that made all the hard work worthwhile. The businessman who had supported her on that original flight was now running diversity initiatives across his entire corporate network. "You showed us that changing culture isn't just good ethics, it's good business," he told the conference attendees during his speech. The numbers backed him up. Companies that had adopted similar training programs saw improved customer loyalty and employee satisfaction. As the conference wrapped up, a young aviation student approached the attorney with tears in her eyes. "Your story was the reason I decided to pursue my dream of working in aviation," she said. "I was afraid I wouldn't be accepted, but you showed me that change is possible when we stand up with dignity." The attorney looked around the room one last time. The changes went far beyond new policies and training programs. They had created a ripple effect that touched every aspect of air travel. From the check-in counter to the cockpit, people were more aware, more compassionate, and more committed to treating everyone with respect. Walking off stage, she remembered her grandmother's words about education being power. She had educated an entire industry, not through force or fear, but through understanding and determination. The skies had truly become friendlier, more inclusive, and more welcoming to everyone who dreamed of flying. 5 years had passed since that life-changing flight, and the attorney found herself back in first class, this time as the keynote speaker for the Global Aviation Summit. As she settled into her seat, she couldn't help but smile at how different everything felt. The crew greeted every passenger with genuine warmth, and the diversity among both passengers and staff was striking. The young flight attendant who'd once been a nervous trainee was now the chief of crew training for the entire airline. She walked down the aisle, confident and proud, wearing the gold wings that marked her senior position. "I still tell your story in every training session," she said, stopping by to chat. "It's become part of our airline's DNA." Looking out the window, the attorney reflected on how far they'd come. The training program she developed had been adopted by airlines in over 30 countries. It wasn't just about avoiding discrimination anymore. It had evolved into a complete transformation of how the aviation industry viewed customer service and human dignity. Her phone buzzed with a new message. A mother had sent a photo of her daughter's college graduation. "Remember the little girl who wrote to you 5 years ago? She just graduated with a degree in aviation management. You showed her what was possible." These messages never failed to touch her heart. The original viral video had become a case study in business schools worldwide. But more importantly, it had sparked countless quiet revolutions. Ground crew members felt empowered to speak up against unfair treatment. Passengers from all backgrounds shared stories of feeling truly welcome in the skies. The industry's culture had shifted from tolerance to genuine inclusion. During the flight, she chatted with a young businessman who had no idea who she was. "You know," he said, "flying used to be so different. My parents tell me stories about discrimination they faced. But now," he gestured around the cabin, "it feels like this is how it always should have been." The pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing their approach to the summit venue. She was one of the many professionals who had entered aviation because of the changes that followed that infamous flight. "The skies belong to everyone," she often said in her own speaking engagements. As they began their descent, the attorney opened her keynote speech notes. The title read, "From Moment to Movement: How One Stand for Dignity Changed an Industry." But the real story was in the faces she saw every time she flew: the diverse crews, the confident passengers, the new generation who never knew it any other way. The elderly woman who had supported her years ago had passed away, but her legacy lived on through a scholarship program for underprivileged students pursuing aviation careers. Her granddaughter, the journalist, had gone on to become a leading voice in transportation equity reporting. Just before landing, a flight attendant handed her a stack of notes, messages from the crew. Each one shared a personal story of how the changes had affected their lives and careers. "You didn't just change policies," one read. "You changed hearts." As the plane touched down, she thought about her grandmother's old saying about education being power. She had educated an industry, but more importantly, she had shown that change was possible when people chose dignity over anger, education over retaliation, and unity over division. The summit organizers were waiting at the gate with a surprise: a group of young aviation students from around the world, all inspired by her story. Their faces shone with hope and determination, ready to take the legacy of change even further. Looking at them, she knew that her story hadn't really ended. It had multiplied into thousands of new beginnings. Every person who chose to stand up with dignity, every crew member who embraced true equality, every passenger who felt welcome in the skies, they were all part of a continuing story of transformation that would inspire generations to come.